As we move to a greener future, the Coast Guard must stay ahead of the curve in supporting and enforcing emissions regulations, promoting clean energy adoption, and developing new technologies to reduce the carbon footprint of vessels. This protects our environment while positioning the U.S. maritime industry to lead in the development and deployment of sustainable maritime practices on a global scale. We need to invest in the Coast Guard's capabilities, ensuring it has the resources, personnel, and equipment to address emerging threats and demands. These investments include sufficient funding for research and development, acquisition of advanced technologies, and training programs that enable our Coast Guard personnel to adapt to evolving mission requirements. The Coast Guard must continue to prioritize innovation and the development of cutting-edge technologies. Through research and development initiatives, we can find innovative solutions to the challenges at hand. By embracing emerging technologies such as unmanned systems and renewable energy sources, we can enhance the Coast Guard's capabilities while reducing our environmental impact. By enhancing these authorities to meet evolving mission demands, we ensure the safety and security of our coastlines, protect the environment, and position the Coast Guard and the U.S. maritime industry as leaders in maritime operations and sustainability. The Coast Guard needs the necessary tools, authorities, and resources to address these challenges. Our actions today will help shape the future of our coastal communities, our maritime industries, and the well-being of our planet for generations. So I hope today we can have a productive bipartisan discussion on how to better position our Coast Guard for the future. Thank you, and I yield back.
Now I recognize today's ranking member, Mr. Auchincloss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Webster. I also would like to begin by acknowledging the Coast Guard's ongoing search and rescue efforts out of Boston to find the submersible that went missing near the wreck of the Titanic. Our thoughts are with the missing and their families, and with the men and women of the Coast Guard and their allied services who continue to search for them. Every mission the Coast Guard conducts will change or expand in the coming decade as climate change causes more severe weather, which complicates search and rescue and compounds shoreside infrastructure maintenance. Melting sea ice is opening new shipping lanes. Supporting our allies in the Pacific demands more Coast Guard resources. Increasing cyber attacks require a new type of coastie, and new offshore space flight and wind activity will be important opportunities to expand the Coast Guard's role in facilitating climate and commercial innovation. To be ready for the future, the Coast Guard must continuously evaluate resource allocation, clearly state its funding requirements, and demonstrate its ability to steward its funding strategically and efficiently. I want to thank the National Academies for their work on the report prompting today's hearing, titled The Coast Guard's Next Decade, an assessment of emerging challenges and statutory needs. Their report identifies 10 issues that will require Coast Guard foresight, additional resources, and in some cases, additional authority. I'd like to touch upon several of these issues as well as the recommendations. There are few industrial sectors as innovative as commercial spaceflight. Over the past 5 years, commercial space launches and reentries have more than doubled, and that number will only grow. The Coast Guard's role in commercial spaceflight is to ensure safety in the maritime domain. That responsibility becomes vital during a reentry landing at sea on maritime vessels. To ensure safety, the Coast Guard establishes safety zones to limit or restrict vessel traffic around a landing site. The Coast Guard, however, does not have the authority to establish safety zones beyond 12 nautical miles. The National Academies appropriately flags this issue, and Congress must consider extending the Coast Guard's authority. The proliferation of offshore wind is another critical area to examine. I completely support President Biden's goal of reaching 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, as many of my colleagues on T&I are probably aware. To ensure we can reach this goal, the Coast Guard must work to facilitate access and navigation, ensure that vessels are safe in these areas, and allow offshore wind to thrive. While the service has the requisite authority, it must act promptly regarding regulatory decisions and prepare for the increased demand on search and rescue, response, and security so that we can meet the President's ambitious climate and clean energy goals. In conclusion 3, the Academy states that, quote, the Coast Guard needs the sustained vision, resources, and leadership commitment to meet future challenges, end quote. I have full confidence in Admiral Fagan's vision and the commitment of Coast Guard leadership. I am, however, concerned with Congress's obligation to provide necessary funding. As some of my colleagues continue to call for a return to 22 funding, I want to be clear about the impact that would have on the Coast Guard. As we saw in 2019 when coasties were forced to go without pay, the Coast Guard is not protected by the Department of Defense funding umbrella. 22 funding levels for the Coast Guard would mean fewer maritime drug interdictions, which means more fentanyl in all of our districts. 22 funding levels would mean significant delays in the construction of polar security cutters, of which Russia has nearly 50 and the United States has 1. 22 funding levels would mean reduced search and rescue capacity, resulting in more deaths on the water. 22 funding levels would mean fewer Coast Guard operations in the Pacific, where our adversaries continue to add capacity and our allies need Coast Guard support. Our coasties deserve better, and our country needs better. Every mission the Coast Guard undertakes is critical, and the report before us today makes clear that increased resources are needed to address emerging developments. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning more about the future of the Coast Guard. I yield back.
Well, I'd like to say we're really appreciative of the witnesses appearing today, and thank you for coming, and look forward to hearing your testimony. You've not had the lighting system explained. It's pretty simple. Green means keep talking, yellow means slow it down, and red means stop, time to quit. So those happen automatically. You don't have to worry about them. It just is there. So ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so that ordered. As your written testimony will be made part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Admiral Pullen, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Representative Auchincloss, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Before I get into my statement, I just want to extend our thoughts and prayers to those missing on the submersible Titan and their families. I've had a chance to talk over the last several days with the operational commanders representing the Unified Command in Boston, and they are doing everything that they can to locate and rescue those who are missing. And again, our thoughts and prayers are with them and their families during this difficult period. Sir, thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your continuing support of the United States Coast Guard. And thank you to the members of the National Academy of Sciences Committee, chaired by Dr. Colanisi, for their professionalism and the tremendous work that went into the report. I also would like to express my sincere gratitude to Ms. Heather McLeod and her colleagues at the Government Accountability Office for their collaboration. Congress has provided the Coast Guard with adequate authority to respond to nearly all the challenges that we will face in the coming decade. However, the National Academy of Sciences study identified that gaps exist in the service's authority pertaining to autonomous systems and commercial spaceflight. The Coast Guard acknowledges that we lack clear authority to adequately regulate fully autonomous vessels or to establish safety zones in the U.S. exclusive economic zone with respect to commercial space operations that are binding on foreign flag vessels. Even so, we are taking the strongest action possible under our existing authorities. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 23 includes an at-sea recovery operations pilot program. This will advance our understanding of the actions we must take to ensure the safe navigation of autonomous and remotely operated vessels in the nation's waters. Similarly, we are 1 year into a 2-year pilot program to establish safety zones for space activities and offshore energy development in the U.S. EEZ. We are analyzing the impact, if any, that these safety zones have on maritime traffic. For both autonomous vessels and offshore energy, we will continue to work in concert with the International Maritime Organization to ensure alignment with customary international law. Autonomous systems are but one issue that challenges the Coast Guard in an ever-changing maritime environment. The Coast Guard's responsibility to maintain a safe and secure marine transportation system includes addressing threats in cyberspace, our newest operational domain. To this end, the Coast Guard's working with the Department of Homeland Security to strengthen established maritime security regulations for vessels and shoreside waterfront facilities. Cybersecurity is not the only emerging threat in the maritime domain. Unmanned aircraft systems pose a physical threat to vessels and critical port infrastructure. It's crucial that the Department of Homeland Security's existing authority, from which the Coast Guard derives its counter-UAS operations, does not expire. Without renewal, DHS will lose this authority on September 30th, 2023. To meet the demands of these emerging missions, the further development of an agile and adaptable Coast Guard workforce is the Commandant's highest priority. We will greatly benefit from more flexible authority to involuntarily recall Coast Guard reserve forces to support planned operations. Current authority limits involuntary recall to a presidential declaration or an emergency condition. Now, I understand that Chairman Graves recently introduced a related amendment to the forthcoming National Defense Authorization Act to that end, and I thank him and I thank this committee for their advocacy on this critical issue. It's an exciting time to be in the Coast Guard. We're preparing the service for the future. Empowered by the tremendous support that we enjoy here in Congress and by this subcommittee, and in coordination with international bodies like the International Maritime Organization, the Coast Guard will achieve mission excellence, and we will leverage all existing authorities, and we will seek new authorities when necessary. I want to extend my thanks again to the National Academy of Sciences for their incredible work. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering the questions of the subcommittee. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. So next we have Mr. Coglanisi. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, and Representative.
Of the Coast Guard's statutory authority over the next 10 years. This meant the study had a sweeping scope. The Coast Guard faces a range of future challenges driven by climate change, technological innovation, and global strategic competition. The Academy's study investigated 10 major emerging issues, and the committee identified nearly 36 types of actions needed to respond to these emerging challenges. The bottom line is that the Coast Guard has the authority it needs to respond to most foreseeable challenges. But we found 2 limited exceptions to this general conclusion, and we saw one additional area where statutory change, while not absolutely essential, may be prudent. Let me highlight each. First, autonomous vessels. The Coast Guard here has authority to do much, but even when it comes time when fully autonomous vessels are shown to be safe enough for general use, the Coast Guard will be unable to authorize unmanned or uncrewed vessels because current statutes call for vessels to have watchmen and pilots on board. A recent congressionally authorized pilot program does allow waivers for uncrewed vessels in commercial space operations, but at some point, and we're not there yet, Congress may need to act to provide some modification of these statutory requirements, or at least to give the Coast Guard general authority to waive them as appropriate. Second, with respect to commercial space operations, the Coast Guard again has much authority, but as these operations move farther out into the sea, the Coast Guard lacks statutory authority to impose binding safety orders on foreign flag vessels. Now, the limitation on statutory authority, though, has a parallel in international law, which protects freedom of navigation. And so, too, I hasten to add, there are international law counterparts with respect to the issue of fully autonomous vessels. International conventions contain manning requirements similar to those in U.S. statutory law. As a result, congressional action on either of these issues will need to be coordinated with international legal standards. With respect to a third development, cybersecurity, prudence may dictate statutory change. Current statutes are broad enough to cover cyber attacks, but with Congress in 2021 amending the Ports and Waterways Safety Act to affirm that it encompasses cyber incidents, now may be the time for Congress to do the same for other maritime security statutes. Overall, then, except for these 3 issues, the study committee concluded that the Coast Guard generally possesses the statutory authority it needs, but that authority alone is not enough. To meet the future challenges, the Coast Guard must enhance its mission support capabilities too, including the ability to manage and analyze data, to nimbly produce and procure needed technology, and to maintain workforce readiness. The Coast Guard is working on these issues, but congressional action will be needed too, not only to provide the necessary resources, but also potentially to adjust certain management-related statutory provisions. We urge further exploration by the Coast Guard and Congress of these issues. Finally, because the Coast Guard must remain vigilant and ready to adapt, the service will continue to benefit from its well-known evergreen process. It's vital that strategic foresight be given a high priority and be institutionalized as a continuous process. At the same time, the Coast Guard should build legal analysis into its strategic planning too. Legal foresight by the Coast Guard can help Congress ensure that the service has what it needs to confront future challenges with agility and efficacy. In conclusion, I wish to thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Ms. McLeod, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Webster, Ranking Member Larson, Mr. Auchincloss, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's recent work related to challenges the Coast Guard faces and actions it should take to more effectively manage resources. Coast Guard's unique authorities allow it to seamlessly operate across missions, ensuring that the service has complete and accurate information to manage its workforce, operations, and assets is critical to its ability to meet mission demands. GAO's recent work has identified specific actions the Coast Guard could take to make certain that it has this needed information. These include collecting and assessing information on workforce needs, safety efforts, and infrastructure investments. Related to identifying workforce needs, we have found that the Coast Guard has conducted limited assessments. Specifically, as of March 2023, the service reported that it had assessed workforce needs for just 15% of its units, a process that began 20 years ago. One of our outstanding recommendations from this work is for the Coast Guard to update its workforce planning document with timeframes and milestones for completing these assessments. Fully addressing this recommendation will help ensure that the Coast Guard has the right number of people with the right set of skills to meet its mission demands. Although we think it's important that the Coast Guard continue to analyze workforce needs service-wide, the issue could be particularly important for certain portions of the workforce. Last September, we reported on challenges the Coast Guard faces ensuring it has the necessary cyberspace personnel. We made 6 recommendations, including that the Coast Guard assess and determine its cyberspace staffing levels needed to meet mission demands. Fully addressing these recommendations could help the Coast Guard better understand the resources it requires, including those to protect its information systems and data from threats. Now, turning to safety information, for decades, we have reported that the Coast Guard faces challenges maintaining an adequate staff of experienced marine safety personnel, including marine inspectors. Marine inspections help the Coast Guard ensure that ships are following safety, security, and environmental laws, but demand for vessel inspections has consistently exceeded the supply of inspectors. We made 5 recommendations to strengthen the Coast Guard's marine inspection workforce planning efforts. This included collecting additional data to forecast future industry and workforce trends. We've also noted that the marine inspector shortage can lead to delays in examinations, including to gas carriers. Gas carrier ships that transport liquefied natural gas and other products can pose safety and environmental risks because the cargo is highly combustible. They're required by law to be inspected each year. We recommended that the Coast Guard collect information to assess the benefits and risks of changing the annual inspection requirement. Earlier this year, the Coast Guard told us that this assessment is underway. Once completed, these actions could help the Coast Guard determine whether any changes to its authorities are needed. We have also recently reported on IT and shore infrastructure investments. Our work has shown that despite considerable recent investments, the service still doesn't have a comprehensive inventory of its technology or fully assess its IT network capacity needs. Subsequently, we have made recommendations to the Coast Guard to improve its IT program implementation. Finally, we found that the Coast Guard could increase budget transparency related to its shore infrastructure needs. The backlog of Coast Guard shore infrastructure projects is in the billions, and we have found that the Coast Guard has not provided Congress with accurate information about its funding needs and priorities. While the Coast Guard has a culture of making do with the resources it has, these backlogs pose financial, safety, and mission performance risks. We've recommended that the Coast Guard include better information in congressional budget requests and related reports. In closing, addressing our recommendations will help the Coast Guard improve mission execution and better manage its resources. This completes my prepared statement, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now turn to the questions from the panel, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. So, Admiral Pullen, as cyber security incidents continue to proliferate, the National Academy's report underscores a need for clarify certain roles and responsibilities of various agencies with regards to cyber response in the maritime domain. As the Coast Guard expands its cybersecurity capabilities, what is being done to ensure the service is not suffering mission creep and duplicating the work of other agencies such as CISA, which also plays an important role in this area? What is the Coast Guard doing to leverage existing government capabilities?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. We are building our cyber capability, one, to protect our own systems, two, to ensure adequate oversight of regulated facilities and vessels under the Marine Transportation Security Act and the Ports and Waterways Safety Act, and then working to build capability to leverage cyber as an operating domain for the Coast Guard. We do this in collaboration with all our interagency partners, including CISA. Currently, vessels and facilities that are regulated by the MTSA are required to do a cyber vulnerability assessment and then include in their plans measures to mitigate those cyber effects. For our oversight responsibilities, we are hiring cyber specialists and have hired quite a few, but continue to hire into positions at every echelon of the Coast Guard, at the area command level, at the district command level, and at the sector command level to provide support and assistance to private industry and public sector facilities to ensure cybersecurity. So I'm happy to go into more detail, Chairman, but I think we have the adequate authority, we have the plans in place, and we have the collaborative efforts of the interagency to make sure that we're leveraging all available capability. I should also note that on our unified regulatory agenda, we've noted our intent to do a notice of proposed rulemaking to bolster cybersecurity requirements for regulated facilities and vessels. Thank you, sir.
So are these civilian positions only, or?
Most of our cybersecurity specialists that are helping facilities and vessels with the assessments are civilian positions. With respect to our cyber protection teams, and we have 3 cyber protection teams that are built, those are largely Coast Guard active duty and reserve members. There are some civilian support there as well, but it's largely an active duty force that's well nested with the National Security Agency and also with U.S. Cyber Command.
Thank you very much. Doctor, the report examined the Coast Guard's acquisition and procurement authorities and practices and notes that despite having generally the same authorities as other services, the Coast Guard has been comparatively less successful in executing an acquisition system that is lean and agile. Can you discuss some of the barriers that the Coast Guard can learn from other services? To what degree increased use of off-the-shelf commercial technologies, which the Coast Guard has historically opposed, support the service's acquisition efforts?
Thank you very much. The area of procurement the committee identified is very important, as you say. we did not do an intensive study of procurement itself. The focus of the study was on statutory authority to address those major foreseeable areas. But because these mission support functions, procurement being one of them, in addition to that, we focus on data analysis and management. We also focus on workforce readiness, but procurement being an important one to make sure that the force has the technology that's ready today. Chapter 4 of the report does detail ideas that came before us, but to be very frank, we heard from different points of view from different experts we consulted with whether the Coast Guard has adequate authority right now to address the needs to be flexible in its procurement. It would be an important area, and this is what the committee concluded, an important area for further inquiry to really fully address the question that you ask.
Thank you very much. So, time's expired. Mr. Larson, the ranking member of the full committee, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Admiral, on the issue of commercial space recovery in the pilot, are there standards yet established, say at IMO or anywhere else, for international cooperation on recovery?
No, sir. Customary international law authorizes a coastal state to provide a 500-meter safety zone around offshore installations. So there's nothing in customary international law right now that would recognize a safety zone. However, there is a process to have areas to be avoided, which are advisory areas. And functionally, that's what we're doing under the pilot program with respect to foreign vessels.
For outside the EEZ?
For outside the EEZ, yes, sir, I'm sorry. Yeah, inside the EEZ, we have plenary authority to establish safety zones, security zones. Outside the EEZ is where really the issue is that was pointed out by the National Academy of Sciences. Obviously, if we establish a safety zone outside the territorial sea, it is binding on U.S. vessels because U.S. vessels are always subject to U.S. jurisdiction. It's an issue with respect to foreign vessels. However, even though it may be advisory in nature, that doesn't mean that we don't have other levers that we might be able to use. So if a foreign vessel is engaging in negligent operations, impeding the safe recovery of commercial space operation, that's a factor that we might consider if they're looking to come into a U.S. port. There are ongoing discussions at the International Maritime Organization, but largely we think the advisory nature of this, plus the other levers that we have right now, is suitable for ensuring the safety of commercial space.
So that's U.S. Coast Guard's thought. Other countries' Coast Guards or your equivalents, given that this is not a, we have a very robust industry in the U.S., but it's not just in the U.S.
Yes, sir. I'm not sure of any equivalent with any other country. I think most countries support freedom of navigation, and I think we want to assure freedom of movement, mobility, and navigation in waters that are outside national jurisdiction.
Yeah, Doctor, did you look at that question?
Yeah. We did not identify any other country that would have addressed that matter.
Were you asked to do that, and then you did?
No, we were not. I mean, that would have been outside of the scope of our focus on the statutory authority here in the U.S.
I'll write you a letter then. How's that? That'll get an answer for it. In your recommendations on people recruiting and such, did you make any recommendations about the Coast Guard to types of folks or subject matter expert types of folks, really, about where to focus recruitment?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the workforce challenges for the Coast Guard in the coming decade will principally, not exclusively, but principally lie in the area of high technology, digital technology, cybersecurity. Those are absolutely critical areas for workforce development and readiness for the Coast Guard in the coming decade.
Yeah, I was at the Academy earlier this year and met with some of the cybersecurity students, and all of them very excited, but I can tell there's a bigger demand and a smaller supply, and so, in a highly competitive environment. So, thanks. Ms. McLeod, in last year's Coast Guard Authorization Act, we required the service to produce a detailed assessment and report on its infrastructure needs. Do you believe that report addresses the GAO's concerns about the transparency and accuracy of the infrastructure needs, or are there other actions that Coast Guard needs to take?
We did review that as well, and I think that what remains is a systematic review of priorities. For example, it was unclear to us on items that the Coast Guard was putting forth and then removing from prior years' lists. You know, it kind of comes on and off the lists, and while that's happening, it's unclear if they're using a systematic approach to evaluate the needs and priorities.
Yeah, okay, great. Admiral, in my remaining time, I'll give it to you. Do you have any other update on the search for the Titan and the folks there?
Sir, just what I mentioned at the outset, that the Unified Command is doing everything that they can to locate and rescue those who are missing. I want to recognize the tremendous efforts of those responders who are out there working around the clock, doing their best to rescue those who are missing.
Thank you. With that, yield back.
Mr. Babin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you witnesses for being here today. We appreciate you very much. The Coast Guard's a well-known and vital part of my community in southeast Texas and the greater Houston area. And I represent Coast Guard Sector Houston Galveston and an air station Houston, each housed in Ellington Field in southeast Houston. My questions today are related to subjects covered in the National Academy's report. And Admiral, is it Poulin or Polin?
Poulin, sir.
Poulin, okay. These questions are going to be directed to you, if you don't mind. I also serve as the chairman of the Space Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Technology. In that role, I work regularly with space companies that I know are familiar to the Coast Guard, given the important work that Coast Guard conducts with commercial space operations. The Coast Guard's important role in commercial space operations is sure to grow as commercial space grows. And Congress needs to ensure the Coast Guard has the personnel, the equipment, and the authority to support these operations. So, Admiral Poulin, can you please spend a minute or two detailing the current state of play for Coast Guard commercial space operations? What kind of strain and demand is it placing on the Coast Guard? And do you have the supplies and authority that are needed to conduct this mission?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the
Yes,
question. We are leveraging the lessons learned at Cape Canaveral and exporting that to other areas of the country to build our IQ on how to safely ensure the safety and security of space operations. We work very closely with the space companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, others, as well as NASA and FAA, to make sure that we have a coordinated approach. But your point's a good one, sir. This is a growing mission area for us. When we talk to NASA, the projection for increased space operations is order of magnitude greater than what we're seeing now. I think what it reinforces is what the Commandant testified to at the budget hearing before the subcommittee. The Coast Guard needs about 3 to 5% growth per year to manage our operational requirements, and that means that we need to grow to be a $20 billion Coast Guard within the next 10 years.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. Another question. This administration's immigration policies have led us to a crisis at the southern border like we have never experienced or seen before. While I'm not going to do a deep dive into how this administration's immigration failures have led us there, I do want to hear your thoughts on what the future role of the Coast Guard in combating illegal immigration looks like. The Coast Guard's migrant interdiction operations are vital to our nation's border security. And does the Coast Guard have the supplies and the authority needed to conduct this mission? And does the Coast Guard have the personnel needed to conduct its migrant interdiction mission? And what can Congress do to improve and assist the Coast Guard in its battle against illegal immigration?
Thank you, sir. Our focus in the Coast Guard is on maritime migration. We are seeing at present irregular maritime migration at its highest level in 30, maybe 40 years. And we have had to make very difficult decisions in how we handle our operational priorities. For us, maritime migration is a life-saving mission because the migrants that we interdict are taking to sea in vessels that are overloaded and are completely unseaworthy. For us, this is fundamentally a search and rescue operation. And we are taxed. We're doing most of this effort with vessels that are 50 years old. That's why it's critically important that we continue on the path to recapitalize our cutter fleet and build long-range aviation capability and accelerate our transition to H-60 aircraft as well. And that's all in the President's budget request. It's really important that we recapitalize our aging cutter fleet with the offshore patrol cutter and complete the full program of record for the national security cutter as well. These are game-changing capabilities that we're going to be able to apply to maritime migration to ensure the safety of life at sea.
Is Florida one of the worst, if not the worst, area for these types of interdiction? Or are you seeing anything in South Texas as well?
Sir, predominantly irregular maritime migration affects the South Florida region, the Straits of Florida, migrants who are taken to the sea from both Haiti and Cuba and the Bahamas as well. We do see increasing migrant flow from Southern California, from Mexico into Southern California. There has been some irregular migration across the Rio Grande into Texas on the Gulf Coast as well. That flow rate is not as large as what we're seeing in the Caribbean or that we're seeing in Southern California, but it's still a concern. And we are periodically providing support to the Border Patrol by putting maritime safety and security teams and boat forces units on the Rio Grande for the specific purpose of saving people in distress who are trying to cross the river.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate it. Time's expired. Yield back.
Mr. Auchincloss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. McLeod, well, first, thank you to all the witnesses for your excellent testimony, written and oral. Ms. McLeod, to begin with you, GAO made 39 recommendations to the Coast Guard, 7 of which are being acted upon, 32 not yet. Is the Coast Guard responding with a sufficient sense of urgency to the recommendations that you're making? Do you have any ones in particular that you want to see them act on?
Yes, overall, the Coast Guard is highly collaborative with GAO in addressing our recommendations. Most of these studies have been completed over the last 3 years, so they're fairly new in the process, and we monitor the Coast Guard progress on an ongoing basis on all of our recommendations. It's difficult for me to point to one recommendation or a handful in particular, but I would say at the core of it, one of the biggest challenges the Coast Guard faces is in its workforce, in this environment, and balancing its multiple missions, identifying the workforce that it needs and being able to allocate that strategically is going to be key for the Coast Guard going forward as it faces shortages in workforce.
Please keep my office apprised if there's any of these that you feel like are being insufficiently addressed, or would be interested to know that. Admiral Poulin, the report highlights, the National Academy's report highlights the Coast Guard's insufficient infrastructure in the Arctic, in particular ice-breaking capabilities. This is at a time when China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and aims to develop a polar Silk Road, investing billions in the effort. With increased Chinese and Russian investment and activity in the region, what resources does the Coast Guard need, if any, besides the 3 planned polar security cutters in order to uphold the rules-based international order in the Arctic?
Thank you for the question, sir. Presence matters. Presence matters in the Arctic for us to ensure good maritime governance and for us to ensure a rules-based order. We were on a trajectory to build the polar security cutters, but we recently delivered to this committee and other committees our fleet mix analysis And then that fleet mix analysis, we concluded that we likely need 8 to 9 new icebreakers. Some of those will be heavy icebreakers, like the Polar Security Cutter that's being built at Bollinger, Mississippi. Others may be Arctic security cutters.
Do we need a permanent presence in the Arctic? Right now, it's on a rotating basis.
We need capability to have a permanent presence in the Arctic, yes, sir. And that's one of the reasons why, in the President's budget, we've also requested funding for a commercially available icebreaker as well, not as a bridging strategy, but to add capability to our Coast Guard fleet to make sure that there's model behavior by anybody operating in the Arctic.
Continuing on this theme of competition with China, the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy calls for expanding the U.S. Coast Guard presence and cooperation in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, with a focus on advising, training, deployment, and capacity building. I'm a member of the Select Committee on Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I know from those activities that there is tremendous demand in the Indo-Pacific amongst our allies and partners for Coast Guard expertise and equipment to help them contest increasingly aggressive PLA and PLAN maneuvers in the South China Sea in particular. What resources do you need to successfully implement this Indo-Pacific strategy so that we can be a continued presence, not just in the Arctic, but also in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, sir, thank you. We need to build capability in the Indo-Pacific region. The more we talk to our partners and allies in the region, the greater the demand for Coast Guard support. When you talk to them about their greatest national security concerns, they talk about illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. They talk about the effects of climate change. They talk about disaster response. They talk about a challenge in maintaining domain awareness on their sovereign waters. Those are all Coast Guard missions, and I think that's why the Coast Guard is in growing demand.
And would taking the Coast Guard down to FY22 levels of funding, would that impair our ability to have a strong Indo-Pacific and Arctic presence as we contest Chinese and Russian influence?
Yes, sir. That would affect our ability to provide operations wherever and whenever, not just in the Indo-Pacific region. Our unfunded priorities list includes 4 fast response cutters to help us build capability as a starting point in the Indo-Pacific. Those fast response cutters are critical assets for us. They're proving their value every day, whether it's in the counter-drug transit zone, whether it's in irregular maritime migration, but certainly will prove a high return on investment in the Indo-Pacific region.
And in 10 more seconds, Admiral, the Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study for offshore wind, we're going to get that by the end of the year?
The study has been completed, and it's our intent to translate that into a regulation.
By the end of the year?
Yes, sir. Well, I'll have to.
I'll take it as yes. Time's up. Time's up, Chairman.
Let me go back and check, sir. I don't want to promise something I can't deliver.
Mr. Mask, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank you for bringing up Florida East Coast Rail, Brightline, and the St. Lucie Waterway. Semper Paratus, Admiral. In my experience, the Coast Guard does not drop the ball. That's been my experience with the Coast Guard. I want to bring up a meeting I had yesterday. It was with the United States Coast Guard, Florida Department of Transportation, Florida East Coast Rail, Brightline, and Federal Railroad Administration, and myself. I think it was the first time a meeting like that with all parties, those stakeholders, had taken place. And I want to give you an opportunity to refute a claim that Coast Guard dropped the ball. This was a claim made by Brightline or Florida East Coast Rail that basically they had no knowledge when talking about this waterway, this bridge, these trains that the chairman brought up, that a temporary deviation to how this bridge would operate, local automobile traffic, local maritime traffic, freight rail and passenger rail, how that would all be affected. They didn't have an opportunity to weigh in on how that would all be affected by in ensuring that waterway has the right-of-way, which is the law. So my question is, did everybody have an opportunity to weigh in on that proposed deviation, this rulemaking process?
Congressman, we've tried to be as transparent as possible with respect to the St. Lucie Bridge. I think it was in May of last year. I may have the dates a little bit off, but we issued a notice of inquiry because we were considering what changes needed to be made to the bridge schedule to ensure the reasonable needs of navigation, as well as balance the interest of all the stakeholders involved.
So in that, you did make all of the stakeholders aware, Admiral, that you were doing this?
Sir, I think we did. We tried to do that. We tried to be transparent. We tried to have open lines of communication.
To pause you, Admiral, I believe you, and I just limited time. I have the public comments of Brightline and FEC here. It's 14 pages. To your knowledge, they commented in the opportunity, the public comment section on this rulemaking?
Sir, you're showing me the document?
Yep.
I'll defer to you on that.
To your knowledge, they have been participating actively, speaking to the Coast Guard since at least 2015 about their plans for rail, the interaction between passenger freight, automobile, and maritime.
We have regular discussions and open lines of communication, sir, and we want to be transparent.
And so, to be clear, then, all of those lines of discussion and open communications, they're not all public.
Some of those are meetings with our 7th Coast Guard District. Some of those are probably one-on-one phone calls, any number of different ways to communicate. I think the key point here, sir, again, is open lines of communication.
And I expect that they have the opportunity to call you. But just to say, they've had at least the same amount of access as everybody in the public, if not more.
Open lines of communication, sir.
Open lines, I'll take that. So in that, I'd say, do you have any comment that you'd like to say? It's fair to refute the claim that they had no opportunity to give you input on what these test deviations would look like. And Bob, I'm going to pause there 1 second and also say, we worked here on the Coast Guard subcommittee to actually get language over in the Senate that asked for a number of deviations to try to get to the best place. The current deviation we're talking about is a dividing of an hour in 4 15-minute segments. We asked for deviations also that said 30-minute segments and 60 minutes over 120 minutes. It was actually the Senate that rejected that, but we wanted to see the Coast Guard do an array of tests to make sure that we got to the right place. But that was rejected over there. But I think you've refuted it, that everybody had the opportunity to comment.
Yes, sir, I wasn't party to the conversation, but again, we've tried to include all stakeholders in trying to balance the reasonable needs of navigation with the impacts and the effects on the rail line, navigation, and other stakeholders.
So moving forward to that, their comments in 2022, the trains did say that if they were to even have to give 15 fixed minutes of access to the local maritime traffic, that one 15-minute of access would result in them stopping 23 trains a day across our roads. To your knowledge, was that ever brought up in the environmental impact statement discussions back before in 2015? Because I read it cover to cover several times, and I couldn't find that.
Sir, I'm not read in on that, but what I can tell you is that our approach to this thing has been to find a balance of all the competing interests. We want to do that in a transparent way. It's our obligation to.
And I thank you, Admiral. My time's about expired, but I think you've worked hard to find that balance and find equilibrium between all parties. And so thank you for your work on that.
Ms. Skelton, you were recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us here today, and to the committee as a whole for this critical discussion on the most pressing challenges facing our Coast Guard in the next decade to come. It is so important to me as the representative of Coast Guard City, USA, Grand Haven, Michigan, proud home of a wonderful Coast Guard installation protecting our Great Lakes. As we discuss how we as lawmakers can prepare our coasties for the road ahead, it's incumbent on us as well to remember that our policies would be useless without the support and dedication of our men and women in uniform who we rely on every day to execute these policies and to keep Americans safe. I think we would all agree our coasties are the most valuable resource of the United States Coast Guard. Admiral Pullen, a number of the focus areas identified in the report will require significant numbers of well-trained personnel to fulfill the Coast Guard's mission. We've established in past hearings that the workforce and recruiting deficit the Coast Guard faces is significant. As you have seen last week, some extremist Republicans indicated that they'd be willing to shut down the government rather than keep their party's promises on government funding levels. As you know, coasties aren't paid during a government shutdown. Can you speak to the likely effect a shutdown would have on Coast Guard service member morale, recruitment, and the ability of the Coast Guard to carry out its mission?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your support of our Coast Guard men and women and our families. It's important that we have parity with DOD with respect to pay and benefits. It was hard on our Coast Guard and our families when there was a shutdown and we didn't get paid. It was demoralizing. It had a profound effect, which translates into an operational effect as well. We have committed Coast Guard men and women and families who want to get about the Coast Guard business. They want to execute missions anytime, anywhere, and it's important that we clearly send a signal that they're valued, that they're respected, and that we're going to stand behind them.
Thank you. I agree completely. That's why I have introduced with Rep. Gonzalez Colon the bipartisan Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act to ensure Coasties are treated the same as other members of the DOD, to get parity there, as you said. I know as a former civil servant myself in the Department of Justice what it was like to go through a government shutdown as a new mom, and it was certainly difficult, unstable, with the national security issues at stake. It's just a risk we cannot take. I invite my colleagues again to join me in supporting this crucial piece of legislation. I want to use my remaining time to ask an additional follow-up question. Last Congress, this committee passed and included in the NDAA much-needed legislation aimed at reducing sexual assault and sexual harassment in the maritime industry. This legislation granted new authority and built on the Coast Guard's existing authority as law enforcement to investigate these crimes. It's now essential that the Coast Guard act on these authorities to ensure our mariners are safe. Admiral Pullen, again, does the Coast Guard need additional authorities to continue to investigate and prosecute these crimes?
Thank you, ma'am. We are fully committed to eliminating sexual assault and sexual harassment, not just in our service, but in the maritime industry. We are committed to that end. We don't need any new authorities. We appreciated the authorities that Congress provided in the last authorization bill. And we're stepping out, and we're stepping out quickly. We've got committed Coast Guard Investigative Service agents who are taking the reports. They'll triage those, investigate every report, and if it's criminal, refer it to DOJ. If it's not criminal, make sure that the companies exercise due diligence, and then we have the back-end support through our suspension and revocation process if it reaches a threshold of suspension or revocation action.
Thank
So
you.
we're fully committed to this, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So just to reiterate, at this point, you feel the Coast Guard has everything it needs to conduct these investigations?
Yes, ma'am. We're fully committed to this. We're also working with maritime industry to raise awareness of their responsibilities, but also to potential victims and those that have been victimized, what the reporting mechanisms are so that we can take these claims and investigate.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Mr. Easel, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Countering illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is one of the biggest challenges the Coast Guard will face over the next decade. No commercial fishing industry has been more harmed by these fishing practices than the shrimpers on the Gulf Coast. Over 20% of the wild-caught shrimp imported into our country is caught illegally, second only to swimming crab, which is also caught in the Gulf. To add to this concerning number, foreign exporters are feeding their shrimp with fish caught by the IUU and using forced labor to produce their shrimp. All these damaging practices allow these exporters to undercut legitimate shrimpers in our country with artificially low prices. Admiral Pullen, how's the Coast Guard countering illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and protecting our shrimpers?
Thank you, sir. The first thing we're trying to do is raise awareness globally that this is an international problem. Fish stocks are depleted in many parts of the world, and predatory fishing practices affect all of us. Whether it's on the Gulf Coast, whether it's in another region of the world. So the first thing is to raise awareness. The second thing is to provide more persistent presence in areas where we see a congregation of people engaged in illegal fishing. And again, this is where presence matters and why we talk about building the Coast Guard to 3 to 5% per year, getting us to a $20 billion Coast Guard, recapitalizing those assets so that we can have a more persistent presence. And then it's about working with our international partners and our allies to leverage their capabilities as well. Much of the work that we do is through something called regional fisheries management organizations. These are consent-based organizations that develop rules-based orders for illegal fishing around the globe. And in many of those, we have partnership arrangements with other countries where we can go on board their vessels through a boarding and inspection regime. Other opportunities, there are other opportunities to take shipwrights on board our Coast Guard cutters. But again, the bottom line is this requires Coast Guard presence.
How can the Congress do better to help support the Coast Guard in this area?
Sir, it's critical that we have stable and predictable funding for our major acquisition programs. I've outlined many of those. It's our national security cutters, our offshore patrol cutters, our fast response cutters, accelerating our transition to the MH-60 aircraft, building a full fleet of C-130 aircraft, the polar security cutter that we talked about previously. It's about providing the Coast Guard the ability to deliver mission excellence anytime, anywhere, and provide a more persistent presence rather than episodic engagement.
Thank you. In Ms. McLeod's testimony, she mentioned GAO's findings that recommended a risk-based approach to gas carrier inspections may support the Coast Guard's efforts to address the shortage of marine inspectors and free up resources to focus inspections on riskier vessels. Given the substantial shortage of inspectors, does the Coast Guard intend to conduct the GAO recommended assessment of a risk-based review inspection system of the LNG carriers, Admiral?
Yes, sir, we do, and we agree with the GAO recommendation. We think conducting a risk-based approach to inspections is the right direction. Through one of the prior Coast Guard Authorization Acts, you directed us to commission a study through the National Academy of Sciences to look at this. We've contracted that study. We expect the study to be completed in June of ~24, and I think that'll give us a good baseline on how we want to move forward on risk-based inspections.
Thank you. In addition to the gas carrier inspections, there are other areas, particularly other types of tank vessels, where the Coast Guard would benefit from considering risk-based approaches to vessel inspections.
Yes, sir, I think there are, but I think that study from the National Academy of Sciences is going to be an important foundation for us as we make those risk-based determinations moving forward.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses to be with us today. I got actually 2 questions. The first one will be to Admiral Poling. According to the Coast Guard figures, the migrant flow in the southeast maritime approaches to the United States, which includes the Caribbean transits route into Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, increased by 521% from fiscal year 2020 to 2022. The National Academy of Science report concluded that if current trends hold in the next decade, migration from Caribbean nations will continue to grow, and this will further strain the Coast Guard, creating additional demands for its cutters and crew. And I am particularly concerned about the impact this could have in other vital missions, specifically counter-drug operations, especially when considering that the Coast Guard has already reported that it's been unable to meet the target drug removal rates, partly because of the decrease in the number of available surface assets due to relocation to migrant interdiction operations. So my question will be, in light of those trends, could you tell us moving forward how the Coast Guard plans to adapt to effectively monitor and respond to an increase in migrant activity while at the same time supporting and allocating the necessary resources for other missions, such as drug interdiction operations, are going to be handled?
Thank you for the question. We are seeing irregular maritime migration at record levels, levels that I have not seen in my almost 40-year Coast Guard career. And our Coast Guard is committed to saving lives of those who have taken to the sea and unseaworthy vessels. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is a life-saving mission for us. It starts with taking a whole-of-government approach to prevent migration from happening in the first place. That's not solely a Coast Guard function. We can provide a presence offshore, which we're doing, but it requires a whole-of-government effort to set the conditions to prevent migration from happening. If irregular maritime migration does happen, we're committed to doing our best to interdict and save those lives. It's critically important for us that we maintain the opportunity to directly repatriate migrants interdicted at sea back to their country of origin. Because we have limited Coast Guard cutters, we have limited capacity on those Coast Guard cutters, and the ability to turn those cutters around and bring them into port, into Cuba or Haiti, to repatriate those migrants is critically important. And as I was mentioning also, we're doing this mission right now with many Coast Guard cutters that are 50 years or older, and we need to recapitalize that fleet. This is going to be an important mission for the offshore patrol cutter, and it gives us the capability to address illicit flow of narcotics in the transit zone as well, especially in that vector from South America into the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico.
I was actually in one of the cutters in San Juan last week, so I know what you're talking about. My next question will be in terms of how the Coast Guard is dealing or addressing the vulnerabilities within our nation's maritime transportation system to cyber attacks, and those associated risks to our supply chain and economy. And coming from Puerto Rico, where approximately 80% of our goods comes into the island through the port of San Juan, this is an issue that deeply concerns us. The National Academy of Science report identify a series of actions the Coast Guard will likely need to take to address cybersecurity risk within the maritime environment, and highlights the need to strengthen the service cybersecurity workforce to accomplish them. And I remember we approved the Dodd Jones Act that actually gave some directions to that end. So how the Coast Guard is working to build up its cybersecurity workforce, in particularly at the district and sector level, and how the service partnership is partnering with maritime stakeholders.
Thank you, ma'am. Before I get into the cybersecurity issues, I was remiss in not commending the work of AMO, Air and Marine Operations in Puerto Rico, the Caribbean Border Interdiction Group that operates out of San Juan. I was a former director of Joint Task Force East. I think you and I have talked on the phone, and it would be a failure on my part if I didn't commend HSI, CBP, and all the other organizations that are helping us with maritime migration and illegal drugs. With respect to cyber vulnerabilities, we've got a structure right now that requires facilities and vessels to do a cyber vulnerability assessment and then come up with a mitigation strategy in their plan to address those vulnerabilities. We have cybersecurity specialists that are in the field helping them conduct those assessments. Those are experts that also help plan regional exercises and local exercises with respect to cybersecurity. We backstop all of that with our cyber protection teams that are there to deploy, if necessary, to work with our Coast Guard commands or with facilities and vessels to address those vulnerabilities. Lastly, we are looking to develop new regulatory standards for cybersecurity across the maritime industry. We want to work with CISA and other agencies to make sure that we map over common sense standards into the maritime domain. We want to harmonize where it makes sense to harmonize.
My time expired, but when do you expect to have all the information for the regulations?
It's hard to predict right now. The regulations in draft, we're going through the economic impact analysis right now.
A year?
I can't commit. I wish I could. Anytime I've failed, anytime I've predicted a regulation, I've usually failed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. So another round of questions has been requested. Mr. Mask, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to continue, Admiral, where we left off, that the Bright Line trains said, and the FEC, if there's any fixed window of time for maritime to have access across their own local waterway, it would result in 23 stop trains a day. Those could be 2-mile-long trains going over dozens of intersections. That's what they said in their public comment. I want to go back to the environmental impact statement that was done years prior. I don't expect you to know chapter and verse, so I hope you'll take my word that I'm reading you quotes from it. But it did say in the mitigation in the the impact statement, develop a set schedule for downtimes of each bridge. It was in the impact statement that this would take place. So can you think of a reason why developing a set schedule for bridges to be down or up, why that wouldn't be calculated as to the ripples that it would have on local vehicle traffic? In your estimation, would that be calculated?
Sir, I'm not going to, I really can't speak to the calculation. This temporary deviation was intended to learn lessons, apply those lessons, understand impacts, understand effects, and then adjust as
Yes, sir.
necessary to balance the needs of navigation with other stakeholder interests.
Yes, sir, attempted to learn. But in the environmental impact statements, they tried to anticipate what was going to happen very, very specifically. I'll read you a couple quotes from it. Along the north-south corridor, passenger rail service would result in minor increased traffic delays, not 23 trains a day stopped for 15, 20 minutes. This demonstrates the project would not result in the degradation of average level of service. Again, talking about that. This is the environmental impact statement. Wasn't going to do anything to it. Would have a minor, not significant impact on local traffic. Again, they were very specific in this environmental impact statement. And what I'm really wondering is, I got to believe that if this information was told to the Coast Guard that 20-plus trains would be stopped, if there was just one 15-minute opening for waterway, that you would have been told and you would have passed that on to the FRA. If you were told that, would you have passed it on to the Federal Railroad Administration?
Sir, we're trying to be transparent and collaborative.
I'm not saying you were told. I'm just saying if you were told that, you would have passed it on.
Sir, we want to be transparent with everybody, and we want to have a collaborative approach. Our intent is not to stop trains.
Yes.
Our intent is to use this temporary deviation to understand the actual.
And I don't want you to stop trains, Admiral. I'm just saying, when you participate in an environmental impact statement, if you're given information and you're working with the Federal Railroad Administration, you would pass it on, correct?
If I was in the position, I would.
Okay.
Pass it on.
That's a simple question.
Again,
You
we're just
pass
trying to
on
be transparent. We're trying to be
important information like that. So I'm trying to wonder, either it didn't get passed on, or it wasn't told, or FRA, for some reason, didn't think, okay, develop a set schedule for the downtimes of each bridge. We better calculate what that's going to do to road traffic, even though they calculated very specifically minor impacts, no degradation, not a significant impact. That's on FRA. I'm not saying that's on you, provided that you didn't withhold any, Coast Guard didn't withhold any information. I want to go back to something that the chairman brought up, something I believe is important as well, and that is a new bridge, right? If they can't cooperatively work with local vehicle, automobile traffic, maritime traffic, freight and rail together, because they have a bridge that's 6 feet above mean high water, above a major waterway, and Coast Guard believes in securing water as the right-of-way, and so they rightly gave 2 15-minute windows of access to the local waterway users. I thought that was very fair, but we don't want to see all these ripple effects down the line for automobiles and stuff like that. It seems to me that they shouldn't have put the cart before the horse. They should have built a new bridge first. And this is where I say this. These train companies, they spent, I don't know, let's say $75 million or more on a new train station in Miami, and a new train station in Aventura, Florida, and a new train station in Boca Raton, Florida, and a new train station in West Palm Beach, Florida. Probably 50 to 70 million for each one, probably 100+ million for one in Orlando. And they laid over $1 billion in track, is my understanding. I don't have an exact number, but that's my understanding. Doing all of that, I just can't for the life of me understand why they would omit building a bridge that would have to be built in order to allow for all of those modes of transportation to work together in any kind of acceptable way without holding maritime traffic hostage, or without holding local vehicle traffic hostage, or without having to stop freight rails from getting their goods from A to B, or without having to stop passenger trains from getting people to A to B. It's the known choke point and I can't understand why they didn't calculate it. I thank you, Chairman, for the extra 15 seconds, and I can't yield you anything back, but I relinquish the microphone.
That's so quiet when I walked in.
That's what happens when New Jersey walks in.
Sorry, everybody, I'm in the middle of judiciary.
I understand Mr. Badru may need the time. Thank you, Chairman. I just have one extra question, and it will be for Ms. McLeod. As you explained in your testimony in July 2022, the General Accountant Office found that the Coast Guard did not consistently apply a process to ensure cyber controls were in place for all types of its operational technology, which may include services such as sensors and radars. Your office recommended that the Coast Guard establish a comprehensive and accurate inventory for its operational technology, and that it should develop and implement a plan to ensure appropriate cyber controls are applied to these systems and devices. Could you elaborate on the General Accountant Office findings and the risks associated with the lack of appropriate cyber controls for the Coast Guard operational technology? And will you also discuss what progress, if any, the Coast Guard has made to this day to comply with your recommendations?
Sure. So without knowing which systems exist where and what exactly they're doing, it's really impossible to protect your systems. And so our recommendation was a first step: create an inventory of your systems, identify what systems you have, what they do, and what levels of protection they may need. So that's really the basis of our recommendation. Since our report, we have communicated with the Coast Guard, and they have begun to inventory their IT systems in units. And then the next step will be to create a more broad inventory Coast Guard-wide. So it's in the beginning stages, I would say, which isn't dissimilar from a lot of other federal agencies that we've looked at these issues. The GAO has looked at these issues on. I'll mention, but we are seeing some progress there from the Coast Guard.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Randrew, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Last year, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration proposed rules that would dramatically expand seasonal 10-knot vessel restrictions, as you know, across a large geographic area and many new types of vessels. The proposed expansion of the speed restriction would seriously impede maritime commerce on the Atlantic coast. It is a blunt tool that would apply to the wrong vessel sizes and the wrong areas. I submitted comments supported by the American Association of Port Authorities, the Shipping Chamber of America, the International Organization of Masters, Mates and Pilots Union, and the American Pilots Association, stating that the proposed NOAA speed restrictions is dangerous to maritime workers and it will hurt our economy. NOAA's proposed speed restrictions would also affect over 63,000 recreational vessels from Massachusetts to Florida, most of which do not have full AIS equipage. This would all place a massive new enforcement responsibility on the United States Coast Guard. This is a time where the United States Coast Guard is dealing with an ever-increasing workload and does not have enough resources. Well, I hope that NOAA opts for a more moderate approach as they further develop the rule. It is the Coast Guard's responsibility to enforce the rule when it does happen in any case. So my question is for the Admiral. Does the U.S. Coast Guard have the budget, the fleet size, and the personnel to enforce the NOAA speed restrictions expansion as they are proposed currently? Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman, and I just want to note that I was up in Cape May to celebrate the 75th anniversary.
Yes, I couldn't be, oh, it's,
A home of our enlisted workforce. Thank you for your
I love you guys, and, you know, I may be tough on windmills, but that has nothing to do with you, hopefully. But as far as the Coast Guard and the work they do and what they do in Cape May and how important it is, and that's why we're always advocating, whether it's for barracks or other needs that you have, we appreciate you.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you. I think I'd like to respond a little bit more broadly. We have many different missions in the Coast Guard, and as senior leaders, we're always challenged to prioritize those missions. There's not enough Coast Guard to go around, so we have to take an operational risk-based approach to our missions. And that's why I said in earlier testimony, we need that 3 to 5% growth in the Coast Guard's budget every year to manage those missions. We need to grow to be a $20 billion Coast Guard in about 10 years. And that's irrespective of what we may do in the Indo-Pacific or other regions where we need to build even greater Coast Guard capability. But focused on domestic missions, we always engage in those discussions about how do we prioritize because we have high demand but low density capability in many respects. So we're always engaged in that operational risk assessment, sir.
So, and I appreciate, you know, I appreciate that, but just to be a little more direct, in this situation, would I be correct if I said it would be stressful for you to have that additional responsibility that this rule, in the process of rulemaking, would be a burden placed upon you? And I know you're up to any challenge, but still, I mean, would this be, you know, a stressful situation?
Sir, I think we have a very collaborative relationship with NOAA. Obviously, we want to fulfill our statutory responsibilities. We're committed to the safety and security of navigation, and I think it's incumbent upon us when we see new demands to make sure that we project that. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences report anticipates that we would come to Congress and explain what the demands are and what our resource needs are for growth in current missions or expanded missions elsewhere. And
So you would need more resources for this, correct?
Sir, we always need more resources. We need that 3 to 5%.
I know, but I'm just focused on this one particular area right now.
Yes, sir.
Because I think the rulemaking could go better or it could go worse, and we'll see how it works out. But I think the point is to realize that this affects far more than just a very small segment of folks. I mean, there's a broad swath of regulatory groups, of enforcement in what you do, and just others that are in business industry of different types in boating that it's going to affect.
Yes, sir. I think the Commandant and I have been very clear. I hope we've been very clear that we are not a Coast Guard that's going to do the same with less or more with less. If we need to do more, we need more.
Okay, I appreciate you, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairman. Please forgive me, I have to leave immediately. I got to go back to Judiciary.
That the record for today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so that ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments or information submitted by the witnesses or members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, show that ordered. No one else to talk? Meeting stands adjourned.
Hope it's helpful.
Yeah.